The hardliner who runs Iran's judiciary has won its presidential election. Ebrahim Raisi won 17.8 million votes out of the 28.6 million cast in Friday's election. Now, that dominates the other three candidates who were in the race. Two of them were hardliners, and the other one, Abdel Nasser Hemati, was the former central bank chief of Iran's relatively moderate president, Hassan Rouhani. Now, Raisi's win signifies a major victory for hardliners who've taken control of both the Iranian parliament as well as now the presidency. Now, while over 28 million people took part in Friday's poll, there were some 59 million who were eligible to vote. Now, that turnout number represents the lowest in the history of the Islamic Republic since its 1979 Islamic Revolution. The theocracy takes voter turnout very seriously. It views voter turnout as almost a barometer for how people feel about the theocracy and its legitimacy. So this low turnout does raise questions for the government going forward. It also raises questions because apparently millions of ballots that were cast in the election as well were either voided, didn't have a name, or were otherwise rejected by officials. That raises questions on whether people took part in the poll because they felt obligated to, and then chose not to vote for any of the four candidates that were authorized to take part in the election. Raisi will be inaugurated in mid-August, and that's important because Iran right now is still negotiating with world powers over its tattered 2015 nuclear deal. Western diplomats had hoped to have been able to reach an agreement by now to have Iran and the US re-enter the accord. Part of that's because they're still dealing with the same negotiators they dealt with when they initially reached the nuclear deal. But soon, President Hassan Rouhani's administration will leave, and that will mean there'll be a series of new faces behind the table as Ebrahim Raisi takes power. Now, the nuclear deal saw Iran agree to limit its enrichment of uranium in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. In the time since then President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the accord in 2018, there have been a series of escalating incidents across the wider Middle East. Meanwhile, Iran has abandoned all the limits the deal put on its nuclear program, worrying nuclear nonproliferation experts. Now, it remains in question what kind of deal ultimately could come out of Vienna. The US in particular has said it wants a stronger and longer nuclear deal, and potentially wants to talk to Iran as well about its support of militias across the wider Middle East and its ballistic missile program. Those sort of negotiations would be very difficult for Ebrahim Raisi, in part because he's a hardliner, and hardline politicians in Iran typically chafe against Western restrictions put on the country. Meanwhile, further complicating Raisi's outreach to the world would be the fact that he's already sanctioned by the United States, in part over the mass execution of prisoners in Iran in 1988. Those executions saw some 5,000 people killed and directly are linked to Raisi's time when he was in the judiciary. My name is Jon Gambrell for the Associated Press in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates.